I will tell you what I knew about humans before I met him. I knew they were soft. I knew they wore their emotions on their faces, the way younger species do, the ones who have not yet learned that composure is a form of armor. I knew they lived briefly and burned brightly and died before they had accumulated enough to be worth the grief of losing them. I knew that the Valoran Court's treaty scholars had argued for 11 years about whether the Compact's human auxiliaries were an asset or a liability, and that the argument had never been resolved, only tabled, because the Compact itself would not abide a formal answer. I knew all of this because I had been taught it. My mother's court had particular views on the subject. My advisors had views. The Highland garrison officers who had been stationed at the Valoran Treaty post for 3 years had views. When the assignment order came through, when the treaty framework for the Highland Corridor required a Valoran royal presence at the joint installation, and when the Compact's assigned liaison turned out to be a human male, and when my senior advisor, Velkarath, looked at the documentation and said, very quietly, "Your Highness, the bonding protocol in Article 14 applies." I had assembled all of these views around me like a wall, and I had told myself that I was prepared. I was not prepared. The treaty post at Valoran Highland Station 3 stood at the shoulder of the Cathara Range, where the eastern glacier system came down in a long, slow shelf to the tree line. It had been built for joint occupation 40 years ago, in the first wave of compact expansion into the outer corridor territories, and it showed its age in the practical way of things that have been maintained rather than renovated. The floors were clean, the atmospheric systems functioned, the communication arrays were newer than the walls around them. There was a primary operations hall, a residential wing divided into 2 sections by a middle corridor, a storage level, and a roof observation platform ringed with monitoring equipment that the Valoran garrison used to track the glacier's seasonal movement. The station sat on a rock shelf at the edge of the tree line, 300 meters above the valley floor, and in the mornings when the cloud cover was low, the valley disappeared and the station stood in gray nothing, and in the evenings when the cloud cover lifted, you could see the glacier's lower face hanging above the eastern ridge like a white door. I arrived in the 2nd month of the Highland cold season. My escort of 6 Valoran House Guard officers arrived with me. The station's existing garrison of 4 compact frontier officers was already in place. Davin Mail met us at the landing pad. He was not what I expected. I had formed a picture of a human auxiliary from the court documents, and my advisors measured discomfort. Young, uncertain, excessively eager, possibly reckless. The man who stood at the pad's edge while my transport settled was none of these things. He was perhaps 40, with the particular kind of stillness that comes not from discipline but from long familiarity with situations that required it. Dark hair, gray at the temples, a scar on the jaw, old and clean. He wore the compact Frontier Patrol coat, matte dark composite over plain station wear, with the ease of a man who did not think about his clothes. He held nothing in his hands. He was simply standing there, watching the transport land, with the attentiveness of someone who had learned that the quality of observation mattered more than the performance of readiness. He said when I descended the ramp, "Princess Vithai, I'm Davin Mail, Compact Frontier Patrol, your assigned liaison for the Highland Corridor term. I've had the station's residential wing prepared for your party. If you need an hour before the briefing, that's available." That was all. No performance of welcome, no elaborate title stacking, no ceremonial form. He said my name, the Valoran short form, which foreigners rarely used correctly, the stress falling on the second syllable rather than the first, and he offered a practical choice, and he waited. I gave him a slight nod and told him the hour would be sufficient. I told myself, walking to the residential wing, that this was neutral information, that the absence of performance did not mean anything, that I should not read composure as competence, because the two were not the same thing, Velkarath fell in beside me and said, very quietly, "He seems serviceable," which from Velkarath meant he had not actively alarmed her. Velkarath had been alarmed by human auxiliaries before, on 2 prior postings, and she named the experience clearly and without embellishment. I told myself the wall was still intact. The briefing was operational. Mail ran it with 2 of his garrison officers, a mapping technician named Sorvath and a communications specialist named Leth, and a Velorun senior officer named Commander Aviath who had been at the station for 8 months. The Highland Corridor Treaty Framework required joint monitoring of the glacier shelf's eastern approach, seasonal atmospheric assessment, and the maintenance of a permanent joint presence that satisfied the Compact's Article 9 corridor requirements. Practical work, survey schedules, relay maintenance, rotation charts. Nothing in the briefing touched Article 14 of the treaty framework. Neither of us mentioned it. I had read Article 14. I had read it 4 times, in fact, and had asked Velkarath to obtain 3 separate legal opinions on whether it was enforceable under current Compact statute, and the answer from all 3 had been the same. It was. The Highland Corridor Treaty's bonding protocol was a 40-year-old provision inserted by the original treaty architects to ensure continuity of royal oversight at the joint installation, on the assumption that a formally recognized bond between the assigned royal and the Compact liaison would prevent either party from withdrawing their presence unilaterally. It had never been invoked. The original treaty architects had assumed it never would be. They had been wrong. I did not discuss this with Mail because I did not know how to discuss it with someone I had met 4 hours ago and was apparently going to spend a Highland season working beside. I ate the evening meal in the residential wing's small dining space with Velkarath and my house officers. I told myself the first day had been satisfactory. I told myself the wall was holding. It held for 6 days. The work itself was not unpleasant. Joint patrols of the glacier approach, 2 Velorun officers, 2 Compact officers, rotating shifts. Atmospheric readings at the eastern array, which required someone climbing to the roof observation platform every morning at the 3rd hour and again at the 7th, which I did alongside Mail 3 mornings out of 7, because we rotated the senior officer coverage, and I was the senior Velorun presence. He did not make conversation on those mornings, unless I initiated it. He read the monitoring equipment with focused precision and entered the data in his log, and occasionally asked a technical question about the glacier's behavior that I answered, and then we descended. There was no attempt to fill the silence. The silence simply was, and he was in it without discomfort, and gradually I discovered that his silence was not absence but presence, the presence of a man who was attending to the thing in front of him, and had no need to announce the attending. On the 3rd morning, I noticed that he adjusted the array's secondary screen, so the readout was visible from my position, without my having to move around the equipment housing. He did not mention it. I was approximately 20 centimeters shorter than the array's standard ergonomic calibration, and the adjustment was small, a repositioning of the secondary display arm by 3 degrees. And the fact that he had noticed and corrected it without commentary or announcement was, I told myself, simply operational efficiency. On the 5th morning, I noticed that the log entries in the joint operational record attributed the atmospheric analysis correctly to the Velorun monitoring protocols rather than the Compact's default framework. This mattered because the Compact's default framework was calibrated for lower altitude glacier systems and would have produced skewed projections for the Cathara shelf. The Velorun protocols had been developed specifically for Highland Corridor glaciology over 30 years of seasonal monitoring. He had corrected this in the log structure before I had thought to ask about it. I told myself this was competence, not consideration. I told myself these were not the same category. On the 6th day in the evening, the common dining space had only the 2 of us because Commander Aviath was running a late rotation and Velkarath had taken her meal early, and the others had various occupations. We ate in silence for the first few minutes. Then he said, without looking up from the station map he had opened beside his meal, "The southeastern relay cluster is showing intermittent signal loss. It's within maintenance tolerance, but it's trending in the wrong direction. I'd like to check it tomorrow if the weather holds." I said the weather projection showed clear conditions through the morning. He said, "Good." And then, after a pause that was simply a pause rather than the prelude to anything, "What does the Velorun geological record say about the Eastern Shelf's behavior in the late cold season? I've read the compact survey data, but it only goes back 20 years. I looked at him. He was asking because he wanted to know, not because the question was a bridge to something else, not because engaging the Velorun royal presence in conversation was a required courtesy. He was asking because the glacier was in front of him, and he was trying to understand it as accurately as possible. I said the Velorun Geological Archive went back 90 years, and I could have the relevant sections pulled from the station library for his review. He said I'd appreciate that, and returned to the map. I told myself the wall was intact. On the 7th day the glacier moved. It did not move the way glaciers move in the seasonal records, the slow, persistent creep that the atmospheric projections accounted for, the incremental recession that had been documented for 90 years. It moved in one afternoon, a lateral collapse of the eastern shelf that dropped 40,000 tons of ice into the valley below the station in approximately 3 hours, and it opened a fault line in the glacier's lower face that had not existed in the morning's survey data. The sound of it reached the station in 3 waves, a low percussion, then a sustained grinding, then silence, and the monitoring array's seismic register ran a continuous alert for 2 hours. We were on the observation platform when the first collapse occurred. Mail, Commander Aviath, Sorveth the mapping technician, and myself. Sorveth had the monitoring array at full gain before the sound reached us. The readings were extraordinary. The fault line's behavior was inconsistent with standard glacial mechanics. The collapse pattern suggested a pressure event from below the ice rather than surface melting, which was climatically impossible given the current temperature data. Mail leaned over Sorvath's display for 30 seconds, reading the seismic registers, then straightened. He said, "The survey archive. Does the Velorun historical record have a geological survey for the subsurface stratum below the eastern shelf?" I said it did. The Cathara Range's subsurface had been surveyed in the early days of the Highland Corridor installation, when the compact was assessing the range's geological stability for long-term treaty post-construction. "We should read it today," he said. We read it. The subsurface survey from 41 years ago contained a notation, 3 lines in a geological appendix, that described a sealed void space approximately 400 meters below the glacier's eastern shelf, a pressurized cavity system formed by ancient volcanic activity, sealed under the ice during the last major glacial period, noted as geologically stable and requiring no further assessment. "It was stable 41 years ago," I said. "The collapse changed the pressure dynamic," Mail said. He was still looking at the survey notation, with the particular expression of someone connecting 2 separate facts that had not been adjacent before. Something in that cavity was preserved under stable pressure conditions for a very long time, if the collapse vented it. He stopped. He looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon light was failing in the cold Highland way, and the valley below the glacier was quiet in a manner that was different from its ordinary quiet. An absence of the small sounds a valley makes, the wind through trees sound, the distant animal sound, and the fault line in the lower face was a dark scar in the white. "I think we should tighten the perimeter," he said. This was, I would understand later, the understatement of the Velorun Highland season. I did not know what the void space had contained. None of us did that first evening. The Geological Survey's notation described a sealed cavity of significant volume, consistent with preserved atmospheric conditions from the last glacial period, which meant, for a biologist or a planetary ecologist, conditions that had not existed on the surface for approximately 12,000 years. The Compact's xenobiology database, when Leth pulled it on the communications array, returned a sparse result: theoretical species preservation via deep geological stasis, extremely low probability, insufficient data to model. The insufficient data held through the night. The probability adjusted on the second day. I was in the operations hall, reviewing the atmospheric data from the overnight survey, when the monitoring station's perimeter alert triggered. I remember the sound precisely, a three-tone sequence, middle pitch, meaning proximity contact at the station's outer sensor ring, contact unclassified. I remember looking at the display and seeing a contact signature that the system's classification algorithm was unable to categorize. The algorithm offered three possibilities and rated none of them above 14% confidence. The contact was large. It was warm, infrared positive, which meant metabolically active, and it was moving toward the station from the direction of the fault line, with the particular deliberate quality of something that was not moving toward anything because it was curious. What happened next I will describe in the order it occurred, because the order matters. Mail was at the communications array with Leth when the alert triggered. He crossed to the operations display in approximately 4 seconds. He looked at the contact signature for 3 seconds, not long but precise, the way he looked at things when he was integrating information rather than simply receiving it. He said to Commander Aviath, "Arm the station perimeter and get everyone inside the primary structure. Close the outer doors." Then he said to me, "Stay close to me." Not a command, not a request, a statement of intention offered plainly, as if the question of whether I would comply was secondary to the question of whether I understood what he was proposing. I did not argue. I was a Velorun princess with 6 house officers, and I did not argue. This tells you something about the quality of the contact signature on that display, and something about the quality of how he had said it, the specific absence of theater in it, the sense that he was describing a fact about what he was going to do and including me in the description. We learned what had been in the void space within the next 40 minutes. I do not have language in the Velorun formal register for what emerged from the fault line's shadow that evening. The closest approximation is Velsothran, which means the thing that precedes understanding, the event so outside the available categories that the mind must create a new category before it can process what it has seen. The creature was ancient. It had been preserved in the void space under the glacier for 12,000 years, in a state of biological stasis maintained by the pressure conditions and the cold. The collapse had vented the cavity, and the change in pressure had, over approximately 30 hours, returned it to biological activity. It was approximately 12 meters in length. Its integument was the color of old ice, gray-white and translucent at the edges, with a texture that caught the station's exterior lights and diffused them in unsettling directions. It moved with the particular efficiency of a predator that has never encountered resistance, because in 12,000 years of preserved memory it had not needed to learn the concept. The Compact's xenobiology database, when Mail had Leth run a morphological match 2 days later, returned a partial correspondence to a category of apex ambush predator native to the Cathara Range's pre-glacial period, a category the database had listed as extinct for the last 12 millennia. But I am telling this in the wrong order again. When the contact signature resolved on the operations display into something the monitoring system's infrared array could render in recognizable form, the primary operations hall contained myself, Mail, Commander Aviath, 3 Velorun house officers, Sorvath, and Leth. Velkarath was in the residential wing. The creature was at the station's outer sensor ring, approximately 200 meters from the primary structure's outer wall, and it was not moving away. Commander Aviath said, in the Velorun formal register, the phrase that means we should withdraw to the interior and secure the secondary defense position. Two of my house officers moved toward the inner corridor. The third, Velkarath, who had appeared in the operations hall doorway in the previous 60 seconds, looked at the display and said nothing. She had an expression I recognized, the expression of a person who is revising a situation assessment in real time and has not yet completed the revision. Mail said, if it reaches the outer wall before we secure the emergency door, it can breach the primary structure through the composite junction on the north face. The junction is rated for standard weather stress, not for force impact at that scale. I need someone to hold the outer corridor for 4 minutes while Leth runs the emergency door sequence from the relay panel. He was looking at Commander Aviath when he said it. Aviath was the ranking Velorun military officer at the station. She had 8 months of Highland posting experience and a full formal record, and the training of a Velorun line officer who had been through the standard cold conditions combat curriculum. There was a silence of approximately 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, I learned something about rank that the court had not taught me. Rank is the record of what a person has already done. Courage is the decision about what a person will do next. The two are related, but they are not the same thing, and in those 5 seconds they were very clearly not the same thing. Commander Aviath said, the interior defense protocol requires the senior personnel too. Mail said, I'll hold the outer corridor. He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without self-announcement, in the flat tone of someone who has identified the next necessary step and named it accurately. There was no performance in it. He was not announcing courage. He was announcing intention, the same way he announced that the relay cluster was trending in the wrong direction and should be checked when the weather held. Then he picked up the station's emergency kit from the operations hall wall mount, a carry case the size of a field pack, containing the station's primary emergency equipment, and he walked toward the outer corridor door. I remember, and I have remembered this precisely every day since, the specific quality of that moment. I had spent 6 days assembling the wall of everything I had been taught about humans. I had told myself that competence was not consideration, and that composure was not courage, and that the absence of performance did not mean the presence of substance. I had told myself all of these things because they were the things the court had taught me, and the court had taught me well, and I had been taught to trust what the court knew. And Davin Mail picked up the emergency kit and walked toward the outer corridor door, and the wall came down. I said before I understood I was going to say it, I will come with you. He stopped. He looked back at me. His expression did not change, the same focused stillness he brought to the atmospheric readings, the log entries, the morning survey. He said quietly, you don't need to. I know, I said. There was a pause. In it, the monitoring array's proximity alert continued its 3-tone sequence, patient and implacable, counting the creature's approach. He looked at me for another moment, not assessing whether I was capable, I understood, assessing whether I understood what I was deciding. When he was satisfied that I did, he said, stay behind me and tell me if the display shows it moving faster than the current pace. I said yes. We held the outer corridor for 11 minutes. Not 4. The relay panel's secondary coupling had a fault that Leth had not encountered in standard operations, and the door sequence required a manual override that took longer than the estimate. 11 minutes in a 2-meter-wide composite corridor with the operations display, relayed to the handheld unit in my hands, and the station's exterior lights flickering as the creature worked the outer perimeter wall, and Davin Mail between me and whatever was outside. I will not describe the 11 minutes fully, because some of the details are the kind that lose precision in description. The way sounds are when they have no familiar category, the way a wall sounds when something very large and very old presses against it with the interested patience of something that has not yet decided the wall is an obstacle. I will say this. For the 11 minutes, Mail did not perform the holding of the corridor. He held it. The distinction is not a small one. He did not shift his weight repeatedly, or check the emergency kit, or speak unnecessary words, or make the specific sounds a person makes when they are holding a position with their body and their voice, in order to convince themselves they are doing so. He stood in the dark composite corridor in the station's emergency light, which was amber and insufficient, and he was entirely present in the way that a person is present when they have decided that presence is the only appropriate response to the situation. Once, when the creature struck the outer perimeter sensor cluster directly, and the sound was immediate and large and entirely unlike anything in the sound library of my experience, he put his left hand on my arm. Not a grip, not a restraining gesture, a contact. I am here. I know what that was. You are not alone in knowing what that was. The hand was there for perhaps 3 seconds and then was gone, and he returned his attention to the corridor, and I stood behind him with the display in my hands and my pulse in my ears, and I understood in those 3 seconds that the thing I had been taught about humans, that they wore their emotions on their faces, that they were soft, that they burned briefly, was not false exactly. It was incomplete. It was the description of a species, by the people who had never stood in an 11-minute corridor with one. When the door sequence completed and Leth's voice came through the communications link confirming the inner emergency door was sealed, Mail said, "We're coming in the flat operational tone, and we came in. The creature was unable to breach the emergency door. This is a fact about the door's material specifications and the creature's attack pattern, and I note it because it matters operationally. The creature worked the station's outer wall for 4 hours that first night. In the morning, it retreated toward the fault line. It returned the following evening. We held the station for 3 days. On the first day, Mail ran a full assessment of the station's structural vulnerabilities and the creature's observed behavior pattern, and produced a defense protocol that used the station's existing equipment in configurations that the design specifications had not anticipated. He was not a structural engineer or a xenobiologist or a military tactician. He was a compact frontier patrol officer with 20 years of experience solving the specific category of problem that arises when a person is in a remote installation with limited resources and an urgent practical need. He read every technical document in the station's library that was relevant to the problem. He asked Commander Aviath and my house officers for their assessment of Velorun defensive formations that might adapt to an interior defense context. He asked Velkorath about the Velorun historical record for the Kethara range, because Velkorath had been systematically reading it since the Geological Survey notation, and had already identified 2 additional items that were not in the main archives index. He asked me, on the morning of the 2nd day, what I needed. Not what I required, not what my protocol specified or what my formal position entitled me to, what I needed. I told him, after a moment in which I recalibrated the question, to understand the situation as accurately as possible, to not be managed. He looked at me with the same focused attention he brought to the atmospheric readings. He said, "I'll tell you everything I know when I know it, including what I'm uncertain about." "What are you uncertain about now?" I said. "Whether the creature responds to sound as a primary sense or secondary," he said. "The attack pattern on the outer wall is consistent with either. If it's primary, we have different options for deterrence than if it's not." A pause. "I'm working on it." He said it without frustration or apology. A statement of current status, offered plainly, to a person he had decided to treat as someone who could use accurate information. I said, "The Velorun natural history records for the pre-glacial period may have morphological data on ambush predators from that epoch. Velkorath has been reading them." "I'll ask her," he said. He did. Velkorath, who had maintained a position of careful reserve toward Mail since the arrival and who I knew was conducting her own ongoing assessment of his worth, gave him the relevant records with the expression of a person revising a prior conclusion. She said nothing about the revision. She was Velkorath, and Velkorath did not announce her revisions. But I knew the expression. I had been watching her make it and suppress it for 2 days. On the afternoon of the second day, Velsorn came to find me in the operations hall. He was one of my oldest house officers. He had been with the Velorun court since before I was born, and he had the quality of a person who had survived 40 years of court service by saying very few things and meaning all of them. He said, "Your Highness, I thought you should know, the human liaison, when Velmarin's wrist was injured during last night's watch rotation, the emergency door coupling." I remembered. Velmarin had caught her wrist on the coupling bracket in the second night rotation. A minor injury, a sharp compression. The medical assessment had said, no structural damage, some bruising. He noticed she was favoring it at the morning briefing, Velsorn said. He asked if he could look at it, just asked. She said it was nothing. He said that he had field medical certification and it would take 30 seconds and she could say no. She let him, and he reset it correctly. She said afterward it was better, and he wrapped it with the station medical tape and asked if she needed anything for the pain. He paused. In the amber emergency light of the operations hall, his expression was the specific expression of a man who has encountered something that requires the recalibration of a long-standing conclusion. He asked if she needed anything for the pain, he said again, not repeating himself for emphasis, recalibrating aloud. I said yes. I did not have more words than that. The word contained everything that needed to be said between two people who had both understood what the gesture meant. On the third day, Mail found the answer to his question about the creature's sensory priority. He found it in the Velorun natural history records, specifically in a pre-glacial ecological survey from 60 years before the glacier had sealed the void space, describing an apex predator of the Cathara range that the surveyor had named Velsothran. Yes, the same word, the thing that precedes understanding, and that had used seismic vibration as its primary environmental mapping sense. The notation was 60 years old, and the species it described had been presumed extinct by the time the compact arrived, and no one had thought to cross-reference it with the Geological Survey's void space notation, because the Geological Survey and the Ecological Survey were in different archive sections, and the compact's indexing system did not connect them. Mail read the ecological notation in the morning. By midday, he had a protocol. The protocol used the station's atmospheric monitoring system's subfloor vibration sensors, equipment designed to measure seismic activity related to the glacier's movement, to produce a sustained low-frequency signal at the station's outer perimeter, matching the frequency signature that the Ecological Survey had documented as the pre-glacial volcanic activity pattern. For a predator whose primary sensory system had evolved to map its environment through ground vibration, the signal would read as ongoing geological instability at the station's location, a category of danger that, for a species shaped by 12,000 years of preserved glacial period memory, would register as territory to avoid. He explained this to the full station personnel in the afternoon briefing with the same flat economy he used for operational statements. He did not oversell it. He did not undercut it with false modesty. He said, "I think this will work. I'm not certain. The Ecological Survey data is 60 years old and we're working from a cross-reference, not a direct test. If it doesn't work the way I expect, we adjust." He looked at Commander Aviath. "I'd like your assessment of the secondary interior positions as a contingency." Aviath gave it. Mail noted it. The creature approached the station at the third day evening, moving in the same direct line it had used the previous 2 evenings. It reached the outer perimeter sensor ring. It stopped. In the operations hall's infrared display, the contact signature held position for approximately 6 minutes, not moving toward the station, not moving away, simply present at the perimeter. Then it moved to the east. Then the contact signature diminished and was gone. The creature did not return. The compact's regional response unit reached the station on the 5th day. They had been delayed by weather in the outer corridor, the Highland cold season's characteristic low-cloud systems, which played havoc with aerial transit. They arrived to a station that had held for 4 days against a 12,000-year-old apex predator through the application of a 20-year frontier officer's practical knowledge, a 60-year-old ecological survey, and the quiet competence of a man who asked good questions and listened to the answers. The regional response team's commanding officer asked Mail for a briefing. Mail gave it in 12 minutes, precise and complete, with attribution. When he described the seismic vibration protocol, he said it had been developed from a cross-reference between Veloran historical records and the station's existing equipment specifications, and he named Velkarath as the person who had identified the relevant archive sections, and Sorvath as the technician who had implemented the sensor reconfiguration. Velkarath, standing at the back of the operations hall during this briefing, made no expression at all. This, if you know Velkarath, is an expression. The regional response team secured the creature and removed it for study. The geological survey team arrived a week later and assessed the fault line and the void space, and confirmed that the pressure event source had been fully vented and the glacier's eastern shelf had stabilized. The Highland station returned to its operational routine. We were at the station for 4 more weeks before the end of the assigned term. I will tell you what those 4 weeks were, because they matter. On the morning after the regional response team's departure, I was at the observation platform for the 7th-hour atmospheric reading. The valley below the glacier was ordinary again, gray and white and cold. The fault line in the lower face a dark seam that the geological team's preliminary remediation had begun to fill. Mail arrived 3 minutes after me. We ran the readings in silence. When the data was logged, we stood at the platform's railing and watched the valley. I said, "I owe you an acknowledgement." He looked at me. The same focused attention that I had, over 6 days and 3 days and 4 weeks, come to understand was not a performance of attention, but the actual thing. "In the outer corridor," I said, "the 11 minutes, you stood between me and the outer wall." "Yes," he said. "I want to name that correctly," I said. I was speaking carefully, in the register Veloran formality required for a recognition statement, though I was not using the full Velsorath form. That was not the right register for an observation platform in the early morning with the atmospheric monitors running. You did not stay in that corridor because Article 14 required it. The article requires nothing of that kind. "No," he said. "You stayed because it was the right thing to do," I said. "And I was there, and you put yourself between me and what was outside." He was quiet for a moment. A Highland wind moved over the platform, carrying the particular cold of the range's late season, dry and clean and absolute. He said, "You could have stayed in the operations hall." "Yes," I said. "You didn't," he said. And the quality of how he said it was the quality of someone making an observation that mattered to him, not a challenge, not an entry in a ledger of obligations, but a fact that he had noted and was returning to because it told him something true. "I didn't," I said. "Why?" he said, not as a challenge, as a genuine question in the specific tone he used when he wanted an accurate answer rather than a courteous one. I thought about this honestly. I had not fully answered it for myself in the days since. I said at last, "Because it was the right thing to do, and you were there." He looked at the valley for a moment. Then he looked at me, with the same quality of attention he had brought to the atmospheric readings since the first morning, but with something behind it now that the readings had never required, something that was not the performing of attention but the full weight of it, aimed at a specific thing rather than a general survey. He said, "I'd like to know you better, if that's something you're willing to consider." Not a declaration, not a formal claim. A statement of preference offered plainly with the specific courtesy of leaving the answer entirely open. I had been prepared to fear him. I had been prepared for softness and uncertainty and the performance of emotions I did not share. I had been prepared for the human who wore feelings on his face and did not know how to stand still. I said, I am willing to consider it. In the Velorun register, this is not a small statement. We had 4 weeks. We spent them in the way of two people who are learning each other carefully, slowly, with attention, without the urgency that makes carelessness look like passion. We ran the morning surveys. We ate the evening meal in the station's common dining space, initially with the full party and gradually with less company as the others found other things to do at the 7th hour, because the others were paying attention. We read the geological team's preliminary reports together, because the team had identified 2 additional void space systems in the Cathara range, and the ecological implications were significant, and Mail was interested in the problem, and I knew more about the Velorun Natural History Archive than he did. He told me about his 20 years in the compact Frontier Patrol, not as a recitation of credentials, but in the way of a person answering questions he had been asked, giving the specific detail that was asked for rather than the version he had prepared to give. I told him about the Highland Corridor territory and the Velorun Court's position in the treaty framework, and, gradually, more than that, the particular texture of growing up in a court that had particular views about everything, and the specific feeling of being taught a wall before you were old enough to decide whether you wanted one. He listened the way he stood, without performing attention, which is the only way listening means anything. I told him one evening about Article 14. He had been aware of it. Of course he had been. The treaty documentation was part of his station briefing, and he read everything in his briefings. He had not raised it because he had understood, without my saying so, that the right moment for that conversation was not the 4th hour of the posting, or the 2nd day of the creature's approach, or the week of the geological team's assessment. He said, I want to be clear about something. I don't think of it as a requirement. I said, what do you think of it as? He considered. In the lamp light of the common dining space, the Highland cold pressing at the windows, he said, a framework for a conversation I would have wanted to have anyway, once I understood who you were. I looked at him. Not your position, he said, who you are. A pause. He found the words with the same care he brought to everything. The woman who came into the outer corridor when she didn't have to. Who said she wanted accuracy and not management, and then held to that even when the situation was frightening. Who heard a report about a house officer's wrist and understood exactly what it meant. There was a silence between us, not an empty silence, but the kind that holds something being decided. I said carefully in the Velorun form for the first acknowledgement, not the Velsorath, which is the full formal recognition, but the preliminary form, the one that says, I am beginning to place you in the record of what I know. Davin Mail. I have seen you. In the Velorun register, this is not a small statement. It is the first of 3 components. The second and third are spoken when the speaker is ready. There is no time requirement in the tradition. They should be spoken when they are true, and not before. He did not know the form. His Velorun language knowledge was operational rather than cultural. But he heard the weight in how I said it, the deliberate care, the specific register, and he understood that something precise was being offered. He did not receive it with performance or confusion or the particular awkwardness of a person who does not know the protocol and tries to approximate it. He received it the way he received most things, with full attention without hurry. He said, I'm glad. On the last morning before my assigned term ended and my transport arrived, I stood at the observation platform for the final atmospheric reading. The Highland cold had deepened in the last week, and the valley was still and gray. the glacier's lower face holding above the eastern ridge as it always had and would. Mail arrived 3 minutes after me. We ran the readings together in silence. When the data was logged, we stood at the railing in the way we had stood every morning for 4 weeks, and the monitoring equipment ran its regular cycle, and the wind was cold and clean and absolute. I said my name in the Velorun house, Vitha, not the formal address. He said Vitha. He said it correctly. He had been listening since the first morning. I said the second component. In the Velorun form it is, my house names you. It means the speaker's house, her lineage, her obligation, her history, everything she carries, has recorded this person as known and named. It is not a political statement. It is a personal one, which in the Velorun framework is the more serious of the two. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved. The valley held its winter stillness below us, and the glacier held its place above it, and the fault line was a thin seam in the white. He said, "What does the third one say?" "And my house will not set you aside," I said. Another pause. He said, "Is it too soon for the third one?" He asked it directly, without anxiety, in the tone of a man who wanted an accurate answer and was prepared to wait for one. I thought about the 11 minutes in the outer corridor. I thought about the wrist and the question asked without requiring anything in return. I thought about the listening that did not perform itself, and the standing that did not announce itself, and the 4 weeks of careful, unhurried attention that had not pushed for anything it had not been offered. I said no. And I said the third component. He received it the way he received everything, with full attention, without hurry, with the particular quality of a person who understood that the right response to being given something precisely was to hold it precisely in return. He said, "Thank you," in the register of someone for whom the words mean exactly what they say. We stood at the railing until the monitoring equipment cycle completed, and the transport's approach signal registered on the station's communication array. I have been asked, since returning to the Velorun court, how I would describe the Highland posting. Velkorath asks me in the way she asks difficult questions, indirectly, in the form of practical inquiry, because she wants the accurate answer and understands that direct questions sometimes produce performed ones. I tell her what I know. I knew before I went that humans were soft and brief and uncertain. I knew the wall of everything the court had taught me, and I had built it carefully, and I had tended it, and I had brought it with me to the Highland station the way I brought my formal house robes, because it was what was required for a Velorun princess at a joint posting. And a man who stood still in a cold corridor, who asked what I needed rather than what my protocol specified, who put his left hand on my arm in the dark and meant by it nothing more or less than I am here. That man took the wall apart, one accurate gesture at a time, until there was nothing left of it. I am not sorry. My transport arrived, and I descended to the landing pad, and he was there at the edge of it, as he had been on the first day, holding nothing in his hands, with the same quality of stillness. And I looked at him and he looked at me, and the Velorun Velsorath form was complete and recorded and true, and the Highland wind moved across the pad between us, and I said before I boarded, "The next posting begins in 60 days. He said, "I'll read the briefing documents." I said, "I know." I boarded the transport. I did not look back because I did not need to. He would read the documents. He would arrive with his attention and his stillness and his particular quality of presence, the presence of a man who had learned that the thing in front of him was worth attending to and attended to it, and did not announce the attending. He would stand between the thing that needed protecting and whatever came for it, not because a protocol required it, because it was the right thing to do. This is, in the Velorun understanding of the world, what it means to know someone, not the performance of knowing, the practice. I carry his name in the Velsorath record of my house, 3 components, all true. The Highland Glacier holds its cold shelf above the valley, where the fault line was. Somewhere in the Cathara Range, in a compact research installation, a 12,000-year-old creature is being studied by people who will learn things about the world before the ice. They will learn what it was and what it ate, and how it found its way through a world that no longer exists. I find I am glad it is alive. Something that old, that preserved, that patient, it deserves to be studied. It deserves to be known. And I have learned something that is not in the court documents and was not taught in the briefings and could not be assembled into a wall, no matter how carefully. That the quality of a person is not measured by how long they live or how loudly they announce themselves or how correctly they perform the forms that rank requires. It is measured by what they do in an 11-minute corridor when no one with armor or title has moved. He moved. I did not expect it, I will not forget it, and I will not set him aside.